January 1945. The interior of Luzon is a maze of tall grass, shattered palms, and rising smoke drifting over the foothills. The morning light is thin, filtered through a haze of dust kicked up by days of fighting. Japanese infantry from the Shimbu group wait in silence along a narrow trail, crouched behind earthen positions they carved into the hillside. Their rifles are steady. Their expectations are simple. American armor always comes slowly, grinding forward, predictable, heavy. But on this morning, the sound that reaches them is not the deep rumble of a tank engine. It is sharper, faster, almost startling. An American M18 Hellcat bursts from a line of brush with a speed no Japanese soldier had imagined a tracked vehicle could achieve. Its turret sweeps left in one fluid motion, the 76mm gun already searching for targets before the infantry can rise from their cover. For a brief moment, the Japanese defenders are frozen, not by fear, but by disbelief at what they are witnessing, because what they had prepared for was something entirely different. And to understand why this moment stunned them so profoundly, we must look back at how both armies arrived at this point. To understand why Japanese troops were stunned by America's tank destroyers in 1944 and 1945, we must begin long before the Hellcats raced across the islands of the Pacific. The roots of this shock go back to the 1920s and 1930s, when Japan and the United States followed two very different paths in armored warfare, paths shaped by geography, doctrine, industrial capacity, and assumptions about what the next war would look like. Japan entered the era of mechanized warfare with limited resources and limited space. Its military leaders viewed tanks not as independent breakthrough weapons, but as extensions of infantry forces. The Imperial Japanese Army believed future battles would be fought in China's rugged terrain, rice fields, river valleys, and narrow streets, where light, mobile, lightly armored vehicles would support infantry assaults. This thinking produced tanks like the Type 95 Hago, a fast but thinly armored vehicle weighing barely 7 tons, and the Type 97 Chiha, the most widely produced Japanese tank of the war, still lightly protected by Western standards. These tanks were designed to fight Chinese warlord forces, poorly armed infantry units, and lightly equipped defenders. Against such opponents, they often succeeded, but success built an illusion. Few in the Japanese high command believed they would someday face an enemy with entire armor divisions, advanced anti-tank weapons, mass production capability, and a doctrine built on mobility and firepower. Across the Pacific, the United States developed armor under an entirely different vision. American officers studied the lightning campaigns unfolding in Europe and drew sharp conclusions. Tanks would need to break through enemy lines, exploit gaps at high speed, and confront enemy armor head-on. And because U.S. planners expected German armored spearheads to be the primary threat, they created something Japan never built: a dedicated tank destroyer command, a force concept designed to hunt and kill enemy tanks using speed, long-range guns, and rapid maneuver. This thinking produced vehicles like the M10 Wolverine, with its 3-inch gun and open-top turret, the more advanced M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked armored vehicle of the entire war, and later the formidable M36 Jackson, carrying a powerful 90mm gun. These vehicles were not designed to absorb hits. They were designed to strike first, move fast, and rely on agility instead of armor. For the Japanese, this doctrine was almost unimaginable. Their operational experiences in China reinforced the belief that tanks were slow, methodical tools of infantry support. Their pre-war training manuals described enemy tanks as limited by terrain, easily ambushed, and predictable in movement. Even in the early Pacific fighting, the Philippines in 1941, Malaya, Singapore, Guam, the Japanese mostly encountered obsolete or lightly armored Allied vehicles. They saw nothing resembling a modern armored threat. This shaped expectations in a way that would later prove costly. Then came the first major shock. The Americans were not only producing tanks, they were producing them in staggering numbers. And as the war expanded across the Pacific, Japanese forces began encountering vehicles far more advanced than anything they had trained to fight. These encounters were still limited in 1942 and 1943, when Marines and Army units fought primarily on jungle islands without large armored formations. Most engagements involved light tanks like the M3 Stuart, which, while superior to Japanese tanks, did not represent America's most modern capabilities. But as the U.S. island-hopping strategy advanced, and as the campaign shifted from small atolls to larger, more strategically important islands, the Americans began deploying heavier and more specialized armored units. Among them were tank destroyer battalions, units the Japanese never expected to see in such terrain. Designed for the wide plains of Europe, the Japanese assumed they would be useless in jungles, swamps, and mountains. This assumption would soon crumble. By late 1943 and into 1944, the U.S. Army began integrating tank destroyers into major amphibious operations. On Bougainville, Saipan, Peleliu, Guam, and many others, American forces landed with not just infantry and tanks, but with fast-moving, high-powered artillery on-tracks vehicles that could rapidly reposition and fire with precision. Their presence challenged every pre-war belief the Japanese held about how the Americans would fight. Yet the full extent of the shock would not be felt until the fighting returned to the Philippines in late 1944, when U.S. forces deployed larger numbers of tank destroyers, especially M10s and, most dramatically, M18 Hellcats. These vehicles defied Japanese expectations not only in speed, but in the way American crews used them. For the first time, Japanese infantry witnessed armored vehicles that did not behave like tanks at all. They maneuvered unpredictably, appeared suddenly at unexpected angles, and struck from distances previously considered impossible in Pacific combat. To understand how this transformation unfolded across the islands and why it created such tactical and psychological disruption, we must now look at the broader strategic environment of 1943 to 1944, when the United States brought tank destroyers into the Pacific in force and Japanese commanders began confronting a threat they had never prepared for. By 1943, the Pacific War was shifting into a new phase, one that forced the Japanese Army to confront American firepower on a scale never seen in the earlier island battles. The U.S. had reorganized, rearmed, and refined its combined arms methods. Artillery, naval gunfire, tanks, engineers, and infantry now moved as coordinated elements. And within that evolving machine, the arrival of tank destroyer units added a new layer of speed and striking power. The first major deployments came during the Solomon Islands campaign. On Bougainville in late 1943, U.S. Army forces brought ashore M3 GMCs, improvised tank destroyers mounting 75mm guns on half-tracks. Though primitive compared to later designs, they provided long-range, direct-fire support that Japanese defenders found difficult to counter. These vehicles targeted bunkers from distances beyond the reach of Japanese anti-tank rifles or light field guns. It was here that Japanese officers began noting an unusual pattern. American armored vehicles were engaging from farther away, with more accuracy, and with greater mobility than expected. But this was only the beginning. As the U.S. closed in on the Marianas the following summer, the Pacific battlefield expanded dramatically. Saipan, Guam, and Tinian were not small jungle islands. They were larger, with open fields, ridges, coastal plains, and road networks that allowed American armor to maneuver more freely. For the first time, the U.S. could bring in heavier and more advanced vehicles, including the M10 Wolverine. Its 3-inch gun had the power to destroy any Japanese tank from well outside normal combat range. Japanese defenders, accustomed to dealing with lightly armored Stuarts, were surprised not only by the gun's reach, but by the precision with which American crews used it. At Guam in July 1944, tank destroyers worked closely with Marine infantry during assaults on fortified ridge positions. Japanese troops attempting to counterattack using Type 95 light tanks often found themselves under fire before they even saw the American vehicles. Some of the earliest frontline reports from Japanese officers described the shock of having their own tanks destroyed from great distance by guns of unexpected strength. Still, the true revelation was yet to come. As the Americans pushed toward the Philippines, new tank destroyer battalions were attached to assault forces. Among their vehicles was the M18 Hellcat, a machine the Japanese had never encountered and never envisioned. Weighing under 20 tons but armed with a formidable 76mm gun, the Hellcat could reach speeds up to 55 miles per hour on roads and astonishingly high speeds even across rough ground. This combination of firepower and agility was unmatched anywhere in the Pacific. By the time U.S. forces landed at Leyte in October 1944, the Japanese command structure was in crisis. Supply routes were collapsing under relentless air and naval pressure. Armored units were scattered, under strength, and operating with outdated vehicles. The few medium tanks available, the Type 97 Chiha and its later Shinhodo upgrade, could not match American armor, let alone the long-range accuracy of tank destroyers. Japanese infantry units therefore relied on close assault tactics, explosive charges, and well-camouflaged defensive positions to counter U.S. vehicles. These methods had worked earlier in the war, especially against slow-moving tanks that had to push directly into strong points. But tank destroyers did not behave like tanks. They attacked from unexpected angles, shifted positions rapidly, and used elevation changes to fire into bunker entrances or trench lines. This new threat became unmistakable during the Luzon campaign in early 1945. By then, American forces deployed significant numbers of M10s and M18s, often operating in coordination with artillery observers and ground patrols. Japanese troops defending the hills east of Manila described the moment when tank destroyers would appear without warning, fire a series of rapid, accurate shells, and disappear behind vegetation or terrain features before counterfire could be directed. One veteran later wrote in a unit report, "Their armored vehicles moved with the quickness of cavalry." It was not poetic exaggeration. It was a genuine reflection of how outmatched Japanese forces felt. The contrast between Japanese armored expectations and American capabilities was stark. Japan entered the war believing that tanks would move slowly, be limited by terrain, and vulnerable to infantry attacks. The Americans entered the later Pacific campaigns with vehicles that could traverse open ground at high speed, deliver long-range fire, and reposition before defenders could react. This doctrinal gap set the stage for the encounters that followed. And to fully understand the impact of these machines, not just technologically, but psychologically and tactically, we must explore the conflict from several key angles. American tank destroyers were built on a simple but radical idea. Speed could be a weapon. Unlike traditional tanks, which relied on thick armor to survive hits, U.S. tank destroyers sacrificed protection for mobility and firepower. This philosophy produced vehicles unlike anything the Japanese Army had envisioned facing on Pacific battlefields. The M10 Wolverine, the first widely used American tank destroyer, mounted a powerful 3-inch, 76.2mm gun capable of knocking out any Japanese vehicle with ease. Its open top turret gave crews superior visibility, allowing them to track targets quickly and coordinate with infantry or artillery spotters. To the Japanese, whose tanks often mounted low-velocity 57mm or 47mm guns, the M10's accuracy and penetrating power were extraordinary. Infantry who expected to fight armored vehicles at close range suddenly found themselves engaged from hundreds of meters away. Then came the M18 Hellcat, a machine that redefined armored mobility. Its top speed, over 50 miles per hour on roads, was beyond anything fielded by any army in the Pacific. Even in jungle terrain or volcanic ridges, the Hellcat's agility allowed it to reposition faster than Japanese anti-tank teams could respond. American crews learned to fire, reverse, flank, and reappear in entirely new firing angles in a matter of seconds. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to slow, methodical armor, these vehicles seemed almost unpredictable. Their speed made them harder to ambush. Their firepower made them dangerous at ranges once thought impossible. And their combined capabilities created a technological mismatch that would only widen as the war pushes deeper into the Philippine Islands. Japanese infantry entered the Pacific War with deeply rooted assumptions about how tanks behaved. Pre-war manuals described enemy armor as something that moved slowly, stayed on roads or open ground, and relied heavily on infantry support. Training emphasized close assault tactics. Soldiers with explosive charges, Molotov cocktails, magnetic mines, or satchel bags would attack tanks from blind spots, often at night or from concealed pits. These tactics had worked against lighter Allied tanks in 1941 to 1942, but they were designed for predictable armored movements, and American tank destroyers were anything but predictable. When M10s and M18s entered the Pacific, Japanese units often set up elaborate ambushes along narrow approach routes. They expected U.S. armored forces to move directly into kill zones. Instead, tank destroyers used their mobility to bypass choke points, cut through fields or secondary paths, and attack from angles that Japanese defenders had not fortified. A position prepared to repel a frontal tank advance suddenly found itself flanked by a vehicle firing from elevation or striking from the far side of a ridge. Close assault tactics became far more dangerous. Tank destroyers reversed more quickly than tanks, sprinted out of danger zones, and could reposition before infantry could close the distance. Units trained to crawl forward under fire now faced vehicles that changed location faster than reconnaissance teams could report. This tactical mismatch forced Japanese commanders to adapt, but their options were limited. Heavy anti-tank guns were scarce. Mines were in short supply, and communication breakdowns made coordinated responses nearly impossible. A battlefield once shaped around the expectation of slow armor had become a place where American vehicles appeared, disappeared, and returned before the defenders could adjust. Behind every tank destroyer was a crew of 5 men: driver, assistant driver, gunner, loader, and commander. Most were young, often in their early 20s, and trained to fight in open terrain, not jungles or mountains. Yet when they entered the Pacific, they adapted quickly. Many crews learned to operate in close coordination with infantry patrols, using their visibility and firepower to protect advancing troops and neutralize strongpoints. The open turret that exposed them to shrapnel, snipers, and weather also allowed them to see threats before they appeared. Communication with surrounding infantry became fluid. A shouted warning or a hand signal was often enough to swing the turret toward an emerging threat. For American soldiers advancing through thick vegetation, the presence of tank destroyers was more than fire support. It was reassurance. On the other side, Japanese infantry faced a new emotional shock. Many had been taught that courage and aggressive close attacks could overcome even the strongest tank. Yet these new American vehicles rarely allowed them the chance to approach. Troops who emerged from tunnels or ravines expecting to ambush a slow target often found themselves under fire almost instantly. Reports mention the psychological strain caused by the speed of American armored responses, movements that seemed to defy everything they had trained for. For many Japanese defenders, the experience was not just tactical surprise. It was a confrontation with an enemy war machine whose pace and precision signaled a widening technological gulf. These human reactions, fear, adaptation, confusion, determination, formed the emotional landscape in which the coming battles would unfold. And to fully understand how the Pacific environment shaped these encounters, we now turn to the next set of angles. The Pacific battlefield was unlike anything American tank destroyer doctrine had anticipated. The original concept envisioned tank destroyers racing across open European plains to intercept enemy armor. But in the Pacific, the landscape was a maze of coconut groves, razorback ridges, volcanic slopes, mangrove swamps, and dense jungle. On paper, none of it seemed suited for fast armored vehicles. Yet the terrain often amplified the strengths of tank destroyers rather than limiting them. American engineers cut new paths through vegetation, creating narrow but navigable corridors where Hellcats and Wolverines could move with surprising speed. Tank destroyers positioned themselves on hillocks, reverse slopes, or coral ridges to fire into fortifications that traditional tanks struggled to hit. Their powerful guns cracked open bunkers carved into limestone cliffs, and their high mobility allowed them to shift between sectors more quickly than Japanese defenders could track. The Japanese, familiar with the terrain and confident in their ambush tactics, found themselves repeatedly surprised. Tank destroyers approached from unexpected angles, sometimes cresting ridges or cutting through sections of brush that defenders believed impassable. A fortified line facing one direction suddenly received fire from an entirely different axis. Terrain that once served as a protective labyrinth for Japanese infantry became, in the presence of fast-moving American vehicles, a landscape where concealment no longer guaranteed safety. American commanders in the Pacific quickly recognized that tank destroyers could fill roles beyond their original purpose. Instead of engaging mass tanks, rare in Pacific battles, they became mobile fire support platforms. This flexibility was encouraged by leaders who understood the changing nature of the campaign. General Robert Eichelberger in New Guinea and Luzon, Marine commanders on Saipan and Tinian, and numerous division-level officers saw the potential of these vehicles to do more than destroy enemy armor. Tank destroyers were assigned to suppress machine gun nests, crack open cave entrances, fire directly into pillboxes, and support infantry during assaults on steep terrain. Their speed allowed them to respond quickly to gaps in the line or reinforce units under sudden attack. Japanese commanders, by contrast, struggled to counter this shift. Many still adhered to interwar doctrines that emphasized infantry bravery and decentralized defensive fighting. They expected tanks to remain predictable and limited by obstacles. The idea that an American armored vehicle could redeploy faster than their scouting teams could report was difficult to reconcile with pre-war assumptions. The result was a widening command and control gap. American leaders integrated tank destroyers into a flexible combined arms system. Japanese leaders relied on fixed defenses and courage-based close assaults. In this clash of strategies, mobility and firepower increasingly dictated the course of each battle. One of the most decisive but less visible angles was logistics. American tank destroyers could only operate effectively because they were supported by a vast supply system that delivered fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained mechanics to remote islands across thousands of miles of ocean. The U.S. Navy's transport fleets, Seabees, and repair units ensured that M10s and M18s remained operational even in harsh environments. Tank destroyers burned through fuel quickly when maneuvering, especially the high-speed Hellcats. Yet American supply lines kept them running. Batteries of fuel drums, maintenance crews working under rain and fire, and steady shipment from distant depots allowed U.S. armor to maintain relentless pressure. Japanese units faced the opposite situation. Their supply lines were collapsing under the weight of American naval and air superiority. Fuel shortages crippled the movement of tanks. Ammunition shortages limited the use of anti-tank guns. By 1944, Some Japanese armored units were left immobilized or used as static strongpoints simply because they lacked fuel to move. Without reliable logistics, Japanese commanders had few options when faced with mobile American tank destroyers. Even when Japanese gunners managed to disable an American vehicle, U.S. mechanics often repaired it within hours. Japanese tanks destroyed by long-range fire, however, were rarely replaced. This imbalance meant that every encounter with American tank destroyers further depleted Japan's already strained resources. And as the battles intensified in the Philippines, the consequences of this logistical divide became impossible to ignore. The stage was now set for the decisive encounters where Japanese troops would face the full speed, precision, and power of America's tank destroyers. By early January 1945, the battle for Luzon had become the largest ground campaign of the Pacific War. The U.S. 6th Army pressed inland from Lingayen Gulf, driving toward Manila through plains, river valleys, and ridgelines where Japanese forces of the Shimbu and Shobu groups had prepared layered defenses. Yet no amount of planning could anticipate the vehicle that now entered the fight in significant numbers: the M18 Hellcat. The Hellcat battalions that landed with the American assault forces had trained for a very different theater: open European battlefields with German armor. But on Luzon, their speed and precision became qualities that reshaped the course of the fighting. Many Japanese units expected American tanks to be predictable, heavy, and restricted by terrain. Instead, they encountered armored vehicles that moved almost as quickly as trucks, striking with the precision of artillery and then vanishing behind terrain folds before counterfire could be organized. One of the most dramatic demonstrations occurred near the town of Urdaneta. Japanese forces had established a defensive belt along the Agno River, reinforced with machine gun nests and several Type 97 Chiha tanks concealed behind tree lines. Their plan relied on catching American armor during river crossings, where movement would be slow and vulnerable. But the American advance unfolded differently. As infantry secured the far bank, a platoon of M18 Hellcats swept forward, not cautiously, but at a pace that left observers stunned. Instead of inching into firing positions, they raced down open stretches of road and cut across agricultural fields churned by weeks of fighting. Japanese gunners tracking the movement through small firing slits struggled to align on targets, moving far faster than any tank they had faced before. When the first Chiha attempted to reposition for a flank shot, it was met by a 76mm round from hundreds of meters away. The hit ignited the fuel tank, sending flames through the hatch before the crew could escape. A second Japanese tank, attempting to relocate behind a cluster of bamboo, was struck even more swiftly. Hellcat crews were trained to fire on the move, and their stabilized gun platforms allowed accurate shots even at high speed. For the Japanese defenders, the effect was disorienting. Vehicles they barely glimpsed were already firing. But the shock reached deeper than tank versus tank duels. Japanese infantry expected to rely on close assaults. Their anti-tank teams, armed with satchel charges, mines, or lunge mines, waited in concealed pits near narrow trails. Yet the Hellcats rarely entered those kill zones. They swept around them, firing on strong points from angles that bypassed ambush positions. Machine gun nests that once expected to pin advancing armor now found themselves exposed to long-range fire. On one ridge overlooking the river valley, a Japanese infantry company prepared to repel what they believed would be a slow American armored advance. Their trenches were oriented toward the main trail, where they assumed U.S. tanks would funnel. Instead, the tank destroyers scaled a lower slope to the east, a section the Japanese had deemed inaccessible for armored vehicles. American engineers had cleared a narrow path during the night, allowing the Hellcats to flank the ridge. At dawn, the first shells struck from above. Entrenchments positioned to face one direction now received fire from a perpendicular angle. Japanese soldiers scrambled to reposition machine guns and anti-tank rifles. But the incoming fire moved faster than their adjustments. For defenders accustomed to controlling the tempo of engagements through terrain familiarity, the sudden loss of that advantage was jarring. In the valley below, U.S. infantry advanced behind the tank destroyers, using their suppressive fire to close on bunkers. Hellcat commanders communicated constantly with infantry scouts, adjusting positions to neutralize pockets of resistance. The open turret that exposed them to danger also allowed unparalleled coordination. When a Japanese machine gun nest opened fire on American riflemen, a Hellcat swung its turret and delivered a direct hit before the enemy crew could relocate. Japanese officers later noted that the difficulty was not simply the vehicle's firepower, it was their timing. The tank destroyers moved too quickly to be trapped, too fast to be flanked, and too agile to allow infantry to approach. Positions that would have held against a conventional tank assault collapsed under the combination of speed, shock, and accuracy. The M10 Wolverines operating nearby heightened this impact. Though slower than the Hellcats, their powerful 3-inch guns provided long-distance overwatch. Any Japanese tank attempting to reinforce the line was met with immediate fire from concealed overwatch points. Wolverines dug into hull-down positions along dry creek beds, firing across valleys with precision. Japanese crews inside their lighter tanks had little chance. Shells penetrated with devastating effect. The psychological effect deepened by the day. Many Japanese soldiers had grown up hearing that bravery and aggressive action could offset material inferiority. But now courage alone was not enough. The battlefield moved faster than they could respond. Vehicles that should have been trapped by terrain seemed to flow around obstacles. Fire came from distances their rifles and explosives could not reach. This was not merely a tactical mismatch. It was a moment when Japanese defenders realized they were confronting a form of armored warfare fundamentally different from anything their training had envisioned. And as the fighting pushed south toward the approaches of Manila, this realization would crystallize in one of the most decisive actions of the entire Luzon campaign. If the Japanese High Command had possessed a clearer picture of American armor development in 1944, their expectations might have shifted. But information reaching Tokyo and the various area armies in the Philippines was outdated, incomplete, or filtered through assumptions that had been formed years earlier. Even when reports from the Central Pacific began hinting that U.S. armor doctrine was evolving, Japanese officers tended to interpret those signals through the lens of their own experience rather than through objective analysis. The result was a widespread belief, never formally written as doctrine, but deeply held across the officer corps, that American armor was inherently clumsy, slow to maneuver, and fundamentally reliant on mass rather than velocity. In reality, the U.S. Army had already concluded by late 1943 that breakthroughs on fortified terrain or mobile exploitation operations required something more agile than the standard M4 Sherman. The European theater's open fields and rolling terrain influenced this conclusion, but so did lessons learned in the Pacific, where tanks operating on narrow jungle tracks needed exceptional acceleration to avoid ambush. American engineers responded by pushing the development of lighter, faster hulls with high-power engines and thinner armor that traded protection for mobility. The M18 Hellcat was the clearest expression of this shift. A machine built on the principle that speed is armor, a concept radically different from anything the Japanese had prepared to face. Yet, doctrinal change on the American side was only half the story. The other half lay in the Japanese Army's deep institutional constraints. The Imperial Japanese Army had always prioritized infantry, the riflemen, the bayonet, the night attack. Tanks were seen as auxiliary tools rather than decisive instruments, and thus the entire conceptual framework for armored warfare remained secondary. When Japan did invest in armor, the focus was on light, easily transported vehicles like the Type 95 Hago or the later Type 97 Chiha, tanks designed primarily for infantry support or colonial policing. These machines were suitable in the 1930s against Chinese forces with limited anti-armor capabilities, but they were catastrophically inadequate against a fully mechanized opponent. More important, Japanese staff officers assumed that the U.S. would treat the Philippines as a primarily infantry-centered campaign. The mountainous, jungle-covered terrain of Luzon and Leyte reinforced this belief. Many Japanese planners argued that tanks would be unable to maneuver with speed on such constricted ground, and therefore any American armor deployed would be forced to approach in predictable, linear fashion. These predictions were not entirely irrational. In many parts of northern Luzon, the terrain did indeed restrict movement. But the U.S. Army was not planning to fight the Japanese on their terms. American engineers constructed bypass roads, bulldozed new jungle trails, and used engineers with explosives and graders to carve tank routes where the Japanese assumed none could exist. They paired armor with mechanized cavalry reconnaissance units, allowing combat commands to surge forward along multiple axes simultaneously. The Japanese defensive system, designed to funnel slow enemy armor into pre-sighted kill zones, suddenly found itself confronted by multiple rapid thrusts instead of a single deliberate one. Fire support coordination further magnified this speed advantage. U.S. artillery and air power were integrated by radio at the battalion level, enabling armored spearheads to call down precise strikes within minutes. For an army that relied on wire telephones, runners, and limited radio sets, the Japanese simply could not react in time. The shock intensified when Japanese soldiers physically saw the American vehicles up close. The Hellcat's power-to-weight ratio allowed it to accelerate with a quickness that looked almost unnatural. In training films, American crews demonstrated maneuvers such as rapid pivot turns, sudden accelerations on a flanking ridgelines, and hit-and-run gunnery tactics, a style reminiscent of cavalry more than traditional armor. None of this aligned with Japanese expectations. To the defenders along Luzon's ridges and passes, the first appearance of the M18 felt like witnessing a category of machine they had not prepared for. Even the Sherman, considered slow by American standards, moved faster and with more coordination than the Japanese had anticipated. When Japanese officers sent after-action reports up the chain of command describing American armor, advancing with the speed of trucks, or maneuvering before we could reposition guns, those reports were often dismissed as exaggerations born of stress or poor observation. The Imperial Japanese Army had a cultural tendency to discount lower-level assessments that contradicted pre-existing assumptions. More crucially, no practical remedy existed. Japan could not redesign its armored forces in the middle of a collapsing defensive war. Even if Japanese headquarters had fully accepted the reality of American mobility, their industry lacked the capacity at that stage of the conflict to produce high-power engines, torsion bar suspensions, or advanced gunnery systems that might have countered the threat. They were trapped by constraints of doctrine, industry, and battlefield circumstance. By the time MacArthur's forces pushed into central Luzon in early 1945, these structural weaknesses had converged into a strategic inevitability. Japanese defensive plans assumed that time was on their side. They intended to force the Americans into slow, grinding battles of attrition on terrain shaped specifically to negate mobility. But time was precisely what American mechanized units denied them. Every rapid thrust, every armored penetration, every unexpected flanking movement collapsed Japanese defensive coherence faster than they could reestablish it. The shock of encountering high-speed American armor was not merely a tactical surprise. It was the moment Japanese soldiers realized that the foundation of their defensive expectations had been misplaced. Thus, when an M18 Hellcat came bursting out of the tall grass in January 1945, moving with a velocity they had not believed possible, The Japanese defenders' moment of disbelief was not born from ignorance. It was the culmination of years of assumptions, industrial limitations, doctrinal rigidity, and a strategic worldview that had failed to anticipate how much the character of mechanized warfare had changed. That instant of shock, frozen in the eyes of the soldiers along the trail, was the result of an unbridgeable gap between what the Japanese army expected American armor to be and what it had become. To understand the shock experienced by the Japanese defenders on Luzon, we need to shift perspectives from the broad context of doctrine and technology to the lived reality of the soldiers on the ground. What unfolded in early 1945 was not simply a clash of armored capabilities. It was a collision between two entirely different mental models of warfare. This is the angle from which historians now reinterpret the Philippine campaign, not as a straightforward American advance, but as a psychological confrontation in which one side's understanding of mechanized warfare had silently overtaken the others. For the Japanese infantrymen stationed along a ridge or concealed in a camouflage foxhole, the arrival of American armor had always followed a predictable rhythm. First came the warning, distant engine noise, slow, heavy, deliberate. Then the sight, Sherman's rolling in line, methodical and cautious, infantry screening their advance. This rhythm had been repeated from Guadalcanal to Bougainville, from New Guinea to Leyte. It was familiar. It was something a Japanese soldier could prepare for. But the U.S. Army arriving on Luzon was no longer the same force they had studied for years. American units were entering 1945 with the cumulative experience of the Mediterranean, the Central Pacific, and the European theaters. Their armor doctrine had been sharpened, their tactics streamlined, their coordination between armor, artillery, and reconnaissance refined to near-instantaneous levels. The Japanese, however, were still expecting the Americans of 1942. This gap between expected behavior and actual capability is the key angle through which the Hellcat's sudden appearance must be viewed. The Japanese were not stunned because the vehicle was new. They were stunned because the behaviors emerging from the jungle that morning contradicted everything they had been taught about the enemy. American armor was not supposed to be fast. It was not supposed to maneuver independently. It was not supposed to leap ahead of infantry screens, nor reposition before defensive guns could traverse, nor appear at oblique angles that Japanese planners had assumed were impossible for tanks to access. This was cognitive shock, not mechanical surprise. Modern military historians describe this phenomenon as doctrinal mismatch shock, a moment when one army's conceptual model of warfare fails in real time on the battlefield. It is the disruption of expectation, the sudden realization that the enemy is not behaving according to the script you prepared for. The Japanese defenders along the Luzon Trail experienced exactly that moment. The Hellcat's speed was the trigger, but the deeper disruption was psychological, the collapsing of an assumption that had shaped their entire defensive plan. From this angle, the scene is no longer just a fast tank surprising an ambush. It becomes a turning point in the mental war of the Philippines, the moment when Japanese soldiers realized that the Americans had rewritten the rules faster than Japan could adapt. If the doctrinal mismatch explains why Japanese troops were mentally unprepared, the second angle reveals how American tank destroyer units created battlefield conditions that magnified the shock even further. This was the angle of tempo, the rhythm and speed of combat that favored U.S. forces and steadily eroded the confidence of Japanese defenders across Luzon. American tank destroyer battalions had become masters of controlled acceleration. They didn't simply charge into battles. They manipulated the tempo in ways that forced the Japanese to react at the wrong moments. Recon units advanced first, quietly mapping trails and measuring engagement distances. Forward artillery observers moved alongside them. By the time an M18 Hellcat was committed to an approach, the battlefield had been pre-measured, pre-scouted, and mentally prepared by the Americans. The Hellcat's speed was dramatic, but it was never reckless. It was designed to be decisive. This tempo control created an illusion for the Japanese defenders that the Americans could appear instantly, vanish instantly, and reappear where no vehicle should logically be. It was not magic. It was coordination. The U.S. Army had learned that mobility was not only a physical advantage, it was a psychological weapon. A vehicle that could reposition in minutes could collapse the confidence of a defender who expected battles to unfold slowly. The Japanese infantryman on Luzon often found himself fighting two battles at once, the physical one in front of him and the mental one in his mind. When a tank destroyer appeared from a direction he believed safe, the mental map he relied on fractured. Ambushes that should have worked instead collapsed. Fields of fire that should have been secure suddenly felt exposed. Every hidden gun position began to feel vulnerable. The battlefield became unpredictable. That unpredictability deepened another angle often forgotten in armored warfare, the human fatigue factor. Japanese units were already exhausted, cut off from supply lines, worn by weeks of retreat, shaken by relentless artillery and air power. Into that exhaustion fell a new stressor, the sensation that American armor was now everywhere at once. American tank destroyers did not just break through positions. They broke through expectations. Their speed outran Japanese communication lines. Their coordination outran Japanese countermeasures. And their ability to shift fire, relocate, and strike again created a battlefield rhythm that Japanese troops simply could not match. By the time the Hellcat in the opening scene burst through the tree line, the doctrinal shock and the tempo shock had merged into a single psychological blow. The men in those foxholes were not just facing a new machine. They were confronting a new type of war altogether. And soon, this clash of expectations, doctrines, and battlefield rhythms would erupt into the decisive moments that defined the Philippine campaign's armored engagements. In the quiet moments after the guns fell silent, after the smoke lifted from the ridges and rice paddies of Luzon, the significance of the tank destroyers became clear. They were more than machines of war. They were symbols of a new approach to combat, an embodiment of mobility, coordination, and adaptability that redefined what a battlefield could be. The M18 Hellcats and M10 Wolverines did not merely break Japanese tanks. They shattered assumptions. For the Japanese troops who had faced them, the shock was both tactical and existential. Years of doctrine, training, and experience had suggested that courage, discipline, and clever positioning could counter armored threats. Yet here, speed and precision, tools of American industrial and doctrinal innovation, overpowered every expectation. A soldier could fight bravely, but if the enemy moved faster than he could respond, bravery alone offered no protection. This was a lesson written in fire and iron across Luzon's hills. From a broader perspective, the impact of these vehicles extended beyond the immediate battles. They forced commanders to rethink strategy, to respect mobility as a weapon in itself, and to integrate mechanized forces more fluidly into combined arms operations. The Pacific War had become a laboratory for speed, coordination, and the psychological effects of armored warfare. The encounters in 1944 to 1945 demonstrated that technological superiority, when paired with doctrine and logistics, could overwhelm even the most entrenched defenders. Yet there is a human element often overlooked. Behind every tank destroyer was a crew navigating mud, hills, and enemy fire, making decisions under pressure that determined life and death for themselves and the infantry they supported. For the Japanese soldiers, the sudden and relentless movement of these machines created fear, confusion, and adaptation under fire. Both sides were learning, evolving, and enduring the extremes of human experience in war. In the end, the story of the tank destroyers is a story of transformation. It is a story of how warfare evolves faster than doctrine, how assumptions can become vulnerabilities, and how innovation reshapes the battlefield in ways that reverberate far beyond a single engagement. The speed, agility, and firepower of these vehicles left a permanent mark, not only on the soldiers who faced them, but on the understanding of modern mechanized combat itself. The shock they delivered was immediate. The lessons they left behind endured.